In the British Museum sits a small clay cylinder, barely 9 inches long. This object, the Cyrus Cylinder, describes a policy so unusual that scholars doubted the biblical account until this artifact confirmed it. An emperor who conquered the largest empire the world had yet seen told captive peoples, "Go home, rebuild your temples, worship your own gods." For Judean exiles in Babylon, this decree changed everything. It ended the exile, launched the Second Temple period, and gave us the word Jew. But what happened next? The messy, politically explosive act of rebuilding the temple was far more complicated than any royal decree. The story begins in 539 BCE when Persia under Cyrus conquered Babylon. Overnight, Cyrus controlled an empire stretching from Egypt to Iran, the largest the ancient Near East had ever seen. Previous empires handled conquered peoples through deportation and cultural erasure. Assyria scattered the northern Israelite tribes. Babylon destroyed Jerusalem's temple and forced Judah's elite into exile. Persia operated differently. Cyrus championed religious and cultural autonomy for subject peoples. This wasn't altruism, it was shrewd imperial policy. Let conquered populations worship their own gods, and they're less likely to revolt. But for the biblical authors, Cyrus was more than a clever politician. The book of Isaiah calls him God's anointed, the same Hebrew word, Mashiach, used for Israel's own kings, a pagan emperor serving as God's instrument. The Cyrus Cylinder provides archaeological confirmation of this policy. Written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script of ancient Mesopotamia, it attributes the conquest of Babylon to Marduk, Babylon's own chief god. Marduk, the text claims, chose Cyrus to liberate the city. The cylinder then describes captive peoples returning to their homelands and their temples being rebuilt. The biblical account in Ezra and 2nd Chronicles tells the same story from a different angle, where the cylinder credits Marduk, the Bible credits the God of Israel. Same event, two theological interpretations. In 538 BCE, Cyrus issued the decree. Judean exiles could return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. The returnees traveled to what Persia now called Yehud, the new administrative name for the province of Judea. From Yehud comes Yehudi, meaning one who belongs to Yehud. Yehudi gives us the English word Jew. The very name of the Jewish people is born in this political moment. The return was led by Sheshbazzar and included the priest Yeshua, but the most politically charged figure was Zerubbabel, grandson of King Jehoiakim, the last king of the Davidic line. The Davidic line is the royal dynasty descending from King David, and a Davidic descendant returning to Jerusalem stirred messianic hope, the expectation of a future anointed king who would restore Israel's sovereignty. This wasn't just a homecoming. It carried dynastic weight. A quick orientation. The First Temple period ended in 586 BCE when Babylon destroyed Solomon's temple. The exilic period lasted from 586 to 538. Now with Cyrus's decree, the Second Temple period begins, and it will last nearly 600 years until Rome destroys the Second Temple in 70 CE. Now, this is the era in which recognizable Judaism takes shape. Everything from Ezra to the Dead Sea Scrolls to the emergence of Christianity unfolds within it. The decree was issued, the people returned, but laying a foundation turned out to be the easy part. Back in Jerusalem, the returnees rebuilt the altar and resumed sacrifices. And then around 521 BCE, they laid the temple foundation. The book of Ezra describes this moment with stunning emotional detail. Priests blew trumpets, Levites crashed cymbals. The crowd sang, "For he is good, his steadfast love for Israel is eternal." But then the older generation, elders who remembered Solomon's grand temple before its destruction, wept. They could see this new foundation would never match what was lost. The younger generation, who had never seen the first temple, shouted for joy. Ezra tells us the sound of weeping and the sound of shouting mingled together so completely that no one could distinguish one from the other. Grief and hope fused into a single noise. A community torn between mourning what was destroyed and celebrating what was rising. Then came the political crisis. The Samaritans, who claimed Israelite heritage and worshipped the same God, approached the returnees and offered to help rebuild. The returnees refused. This wasn't a simple religious boundary. The Samaritans had legitimate ties to Israelite tradition, but the returning exiles viewed themselves as the sole authentic community and rejected any collaboration. Insulted, the Samaritans turned to political sabotage. They lobbied the Persian authorities, arguing that Jerusalem had a long history of rebellion against imperial rule. The tactic worked. The Persians ordered construction halted. A royal decree had launched the project. Now royal interference stalled it. The temple sat unfinished. Two prophets broke the impasse. Haggai and Zechariah urged the people to resume building despite the Persian ban. When a Persian official objected, the Jewish leaders made a bold legal move. They appealed directly to the new emperor Darius, asking him to search the royal archives for Cyrus's original decree. The gamble paid off. The edict was found in the archives at Ecbatana. Darius not only enforced Cyrus's original order, he went further, supplying imperial funds for reconstruction and commanding that sacrifices be provided at Jerusalem's temple. Bureaucracy, for once, saved the day. The temple was completed and dedicated around 515 BCE, and the community held a Passover celebration, the first in the rebuilt sanctuary. Note the arithmetic. From the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 to this dedication in 515 is approximately 70 years, a span the biblical authors recognize as fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecy that the exile would last 70 years. The temple stood, but a deeper conflict was just beginning. The returnees, though few in number, held imperial backing. They styled themselves Bnei Hagolah, children of the exile, and labeled those who had remained in the land Amei Haaretz, peoples of the land. The second term was derogatory, lumping longtime Judean residents with foreigners and casting doubt on their very Jewishness. Never mind that those who stayed had worshipped God in the land continuously. The returnees claimed exile itself as a mark of authenticity. This was not a minor social squabble. It was a foundational dispute over what makes someone authentically Jewish. Right? Lineage, religious practice, the experience of exile, geography. Each group answered differently. That tension, born at the foundation of the Second Temple, would shape Jewish identity for centuries. The Second Temple, dedicated in 515 BCE, stood for nearly 600 years until Rome destroyed it in 70 CE. In that span, Judaism crystallized. The Maccabean Revolt, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Herod's massive temple expansion, the emergence of Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity all unfold within the Second Temple period launched here. The biblical books of this era, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, reveal something remarkable, the Bible interpreting itself. The chronicler retells Israel's history with a priestly lens, less interested in David's political genius than in his role establishing Jerusalem's worship. This is inner biblical interpretation, later texts reinterpreting earlier ones, revealing a community constructing its identity through how it tells its own story. And at the center of that story sits a paradox, an act of imperial tolerance set in motion, not unity, but conflict over identity, authenticity, and belonging. The very word Jew emerges at the moment when who deserves that name is bitterly contested.